beginning in verse 11, and this is going to go through about halfway through chapter 3, we have this idea of how to live in an immoral world that's against Christ. Because that's the type of world that they had to live in. It's the type of world that we live in as well. Even though we live in a nice area that's generally friendly to religion and to Christianity, we have to understand that we still live among people who want to be against Christ and against us. And there's still a lot of sin around us and a lot of temptation. And how are we supposed to live through these things? And that's what we begin to look at in verse 11. Last week we ended with 11 and 12. Dearly beloved, I beseech you as strangers and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul, having your conversation honest among the Gentiles, that whereas they speak against you as evildoers, they may by your good works, which they shall behold, glorify God in the day of visitation. And so they have this responsibility, because this world is not their home. They're strangers and pilgrims, to look for their heavenly home and to stay away from things that will keep them from going home. While they live in this land of sin, they're abstained from physical pleasures, fleshly lusts, those especially here that war against the soul. There are things that we enjoy in life, and there are pleasures, even physical pleasures that we enjoy that do not war against the soul. But there are physical pleasures that do war against the soul and are spiritually damaging. In fact, we could turn any physical pleasure into something that's spiritually damaging if we go too far with it or make it our priority or things like that. But there are certain physical pleasures that we have to stay away from, and they war against the soul, and they war against our trip toward heaven. And so in order to do this, verse 12, we have to have our conversation, honest or honorable among the Gentiles. And as we do that, even though the world around us wants to speak out against the church and speak out against Christ as if we're the ones doing evil, they will see the good works that we do, and they'll glorify God. It says in the day of visitation, which refers to a time of opportunity. Actually, visitation here is the same word that we use for bishop or overseer. And it's used sort of figuratively here at a time when God comes to oversee. And it speaks to an opportunity that will present itself for doing the right thing or having some sort of relief from God. And so they will see your good works, even though they may persecute you for a while. And the day of visitation comes, they'll see the glory of God and what you are doing. So that's verses 11 and 12. And then we get into three specific areas where we have influence in this world around us. And we're going to look at each one and our responsibilities in these three areas. The first one is in regards to civil government. And we look at this from verses 13 through 17. Handles how we are to respond to the governments of this world and the authority that they have, and what is the relationship between the Christian and those powers. Submit yourself. This is the overarching theme of these verses, and each category we're going to look at is an idea of submission. And the nature of the one that you're submitting to is not under consideration. And so these kings and governments of the world were not good, righteous people. Even the kings and governors who might have been more friendly to Christianity at this time, they weren't good people. They were highly immoral. Most of them were pagan and given to all the different things that went along with that. And so the character of the individuals in government is not under consideration in these verses. That's an important thing to remember, because it's not just to the good and righteous that we are to submit, but to all governments. It says every ordinance of man. Ordinance here has to do with the institutions, not the individual laws. So whatever institution it is, whatever form of government it is, you are to be in submission to it. And it breaks that down, whether that's to the king as supreme, so the highest form of government on earth, the king, for them it would be Nero, and all the different levels of government underneath that. In our nation, we have the federal government. We're to be in submission to that, and we are to have the state government. We're in submission to that. We have city government, county government. It doesn't matter the hierarchy of the government that you're under. You still have to submit to it, to every one of them. And the reason for this is given in verse 13, for the Lord's sake. Not for your own sake, not for the sake of your freedoms or anything else, but for the Lord's sake. Because how we respond to government, to those who have authority over us, speaks greatly about our character and our submission to God. And so whether it's to the king as supreme or unto governors, as unto them that are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of them that do well. We have the main purpose of government given to us here, that they are to punish evildoers and to praise and lift up those who do well. That is number one on the government's purpose list. I think today people get things twisted about what the purpose of our government is. But throughout time, number one purpose of government is to punish those who do evil and to reward those who do good. Let's look back at Romans chapter 13, where Paul speaks about this in much the same tone. It says, let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God. And they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. So the stakes of this is very high, right? You'll receive damnation. I believe that's talking about damnation from the Lord. This is one of his commands. If you don't obey the government that he has set up, God is behind the governments of this world. He established that. And so he expects us to be obedient. What is the purpose of these rulers and these powers? Verse 3 and 4. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. For he is the minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid. For he beareth not the sword in vain. For he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. And so what is the job of government? Number one, to execute God's wrath and his vengeance on evildoers. But if we do well, we'll have praise of the same. And again, this is during a time when that wasn't always the case. Paul is not making an argument that this is always the case with government, but it is the general purpose that God has given government, and we ought to treat all government as such, that we are to obey them, lest we become an evildoer and receive the punishment that's due to us as a result. This is the will of God. If we're concerned with the will of God, we're going to heed this very closely. The reason behind this is that when we obey government and we are good citizens, we will put to silence those who argue against us, those who, out of their ignorance and foolishness, speak out against Christ and his people, the church. You don't want to give the enemies of Christ any ammunition against you. And so being a bad citizen will do that. And so we obey the laws. Now, of course, we know that there are instances where that's an impossibility. Peter himself said we ought to obey God rather than men, Acts 5 verse 29. And that's always the case, no matter what authority we're under, and there's different authorities that are going to be mentioned in this text. No matter what that authority is, we ought to obey God rather than man. And so, if it's the case that I cannot obey God's command and obey the government's command, I'm to choose God's side. Sometimes it's the case that I can, through a change in how we do things that's still scriptural, can adjust things to where I obey God's command and government's command. So sometimes that's a possibility, even though I might have to change something to do that. Now, not change something that would cause me to disobey God, of course, but sometimes, especially, the church is not much regulated. Religion is not much regulated in Tennessee. It's not supposed to be anywhere in our country, right? But there's a lot of regulations that people put, like in California and places like that, on churches. And some of those churches just have to disobey because there's no way to do both. But a lot of times it's an inconvenience. A lot of financial burden is put on the church in places like that through the regulations that governments put on them. But they still have to. Inconvenience is not a good reason to disobey the government. You have to obey both. The only time it's not proper to obey is when I have to disregard what God has said and put it aside. All right, so this is the will of God, that with well-doing, being a good citizen, we're putting to silence the ignorance of foolish men as free. Why are we doing this? Not because we're under some sort of, not because we're forced to by government, but because we have liberty and we're going to use our liberty in the right way. Not for a cloak of maliciousness or ill intent, but we're going to use our freedom to serve God. And God wants us to be good citizens and obedient to the governmental powers that rule over us. And sometimes that's difficult because we very much disagree with what the government does. We don't always agree with the decisions that government does. Government sometimes even sets aside constitutional laws and things like that. What are we supposed to do? We're supposed to obey government. Even when it goes very sharply against what we believe politically, or even what we see to be as best philosophically or practically. We are to obey government. There's not qualifications put on this, other than what Peter said back in Acts 5, we ought to obey God rather than men. Now in verse 17, it finishes up this thought with this: honor all men. All right. There is a amount of respect that all people deserve. And so we are to honor all men. Treat people with respect. This is part of being a good citizen. Included in this would be, not to damage people by our words or our actions. Politeness and kindness. There's just a certain amount of respect, not being insulting or offensive or things like that. All right, honor all men, and then love the brotherhood. There is a special relationship that exists within the church that we do not have with the world. This is a brotherhood that we have, and we are to love one another, agape love one another. And then we are, of course, to fear God. The ultimate reverence that we can pay goes to God. And no one receives that amount of reverence that we are to have for God and fear. That is the sort of the gold standard of reverence that we can give. But then it says, honor the king. Now, once again, the king is Nero. And Nero was a terrible human being. He was a terrible human being before he began persecuting the church. There was never a point in time in Nero's rule where someone would look at Nero and say, hey, that's a good guy. No, he wasn't. He was vicious. He was petty. He was somewhat of a weak ruler. There wasn't much good that could be said about Nero. And yet, Peter here says, honor him. And this is a great temptation for us today because we have freedom of speech, and the world around us, when it comes to political things especially, are very harsh and demeaning and insulting in what they say. And as a Christian, we should not be. There is a difference between insulting somebody and criticizing somebody. And I don't think there's anything here that says that we cannot be, to a point, critical. We can criticize somebody and still hold them in honor. But we need to be very careful about the insults and the demeaning speech that we see so often around us in the world. We are to honor the king, even when we don't much like him or disagree with him.